At dawn, on June 22, 1941, the fortress of Brest slept under a pale summer sky. Birds circled above its stone walls, and the Bug River glimmered in the early light. Inside, Soviet soldiers cleaned their rifles, wrote letters, and waited for breakfast. The war, they thought, was far away. Then, the sky exploded. Without warning, hundreds of German guns opened fire. The ground shook as shells rained down on the fortress. Barracks collapsed in seconds. The bridges over the river vanished in clouds of fire. Soldiers were thrown from their beds, deafened, blinded, covered in dust. It was the first morning of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, and Brest was among the first targets. The Germans expected it to fall in hours. They had no idea what kind of resistance they would meet. Lieutenant Andrei Gavrilov crawled from the rubble of his barracks, his uniform torn, his face bleeding. Around him, men screamed, smoke rising from every building. The air was thick with dust and the smell of gunpowder. Somewhere in the chaos, a voice shouted, "To the walls! Hold the fortress!" He grabbed his rifle and ran. Across the river, German infantry advanced in perfect formation, their helmets glinting in the morning sun. Behind them, panzer tanks growled, rolling over the bridges of twisted metal. They expected no real fight, just frightened defenders fleeing east like the rest of the Red Army. But when they reached the gates, machine guns opened up from the shadows of the stone archways. The first rows of Germans fell instantly. Grenades exploded at their feet. The fortress was alive. Inside those walls were about 200 Soviet soldiers, infantrymen, border guards, engineers, even cooks. Cut off from the main army, surrounded by enemy divisions, they chose to stay and fight. The bombardment lasted for hours. Water pipes burst, the courtyards filled with smoke and screams. By nightfall, much of the fortress was in ruins, yet the defenders still held on. They moved through tunnels and basements, using the maze-like structure to strike where the enemy least expected. When the Germans sent in flamethrowers, the Soviets fought back with rifles, bayonets, even stones. The wounded crawled to the firing line. The dead were used as cover. The fortress burned, but it would not die. In one corner of the citadel, a group of soldiers took refuge in a half-collapsed barracks. A nurse named Maria was with them. She tore strips of cloth from her uniform to bandage the wounded. When water ran out, she risked her life crossing the courtyard under fire to fill bottles from the river. For 29 days, the siege continued. Every day brought new assaults, artillery, tanks, propaganda leaflets urging surrender. The Germans broadcast messages through loudspeakers. "Russians, lay down your arms. Your cause is hopeless." But from inside the smoke and ruin came a single reply: machine gun fire. The defenders had no supplies left, no reinforcements, and almost no food. They lived on scraps of bread, on water mixed with ash, yet they refused to surrender. One German officer, writing in his diary, said, "We are fighting men who no longer fear death." The Soviets carved messages on the walls with knives and bullets. One inscription, found years later, still reads, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." By the fourth week, only a handful of defenders remained alive. The fortress was silent, except for the crackle of fire and the sound of boots searching through debris. When the Germans finally entered, they found wounded men still clutching their rifles, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades. Even in captivity, the survivors stood tall. When questioned, one of them, barely conscious, simply said, "We fought as long as we could." The fortress of Brest had fallen, but it had held for 29 days. 200 soldiers had defied an entire army. When the story reached Moscow months later, it spread like a spark through a country under siege. The words carved on those walls became a legend, a symbol of what it meant to fight not for victory, but for honor. And long after the guns went silent, the stones of Brest still whispered their story to the wind. "I am dying, but I will not surrender."
The second day dawned under a sky the color of ash. The fortress that once echoed with marching boots now lay in ruin, smoke coiling from shattered windows, the air thick with the smell of burned stone and blood. The Berg River flowed silently beside it, carrying debris, spent shells, and the memory of those who had fallen. The German command was furious. The plan had been simple: capture Brest in hours, secure the bridgehead, and advance east toward Minsk. Yet more than 24 hours later, pockets of resistance still burned inside the fortress like embers refusing to die. General Heinz Guderian himself sent a message down the chain of command: "Eliminate the fortress. No prisoners unless necessary." The Luftwaffe returned with precision bombing. Stukas screamed from the clouds, dropping bombs that tore open the last standing walls. The Germans advanced behind them, certain that no one could have survived such destruction. Then, from the shadows of a collapsed tower, a Soviet machine gun rattled. Bullets tore through the dust, cutting down a column of advancing soldiers. The survivors dove for cover, stunned. How could they still be alive? Inside the ruins, Lieutenant Gavrilov and his men moved like ghosts through the underground passages. The air was stale, hot, and thick with the scent of cordite. They had no radio, no way to contact command, and almost no ammunition left. Yet the will to fight was stronger than fear. "Comrades," Gavrilov said, his voice low but steady, "if we die standing." They nodded, faces blackened by soot, eyes hollow but burning with resolve. Some were no older than 20. One of them, Private Mikhail, clutched a photograph of his wife and newborn child, the corners torn and smudged with blood. Outside, the Germans sealed the exits and flooded the fortress with loudspeakers. A voice echoed through the ruins: "Russians, you are surrounded! Lay down your arms! You have no chance!" No one answered. Moments later, the defenders unleashed a counterattack, short, brutal, and shocking. From every crack and tunnel, they emerged firing rifles, throwing grenades, shouting, "For the motherland!" The Germans fell back, stunned by the ferocity. That night, the fortress burned brighter than ever. The flames danced against the black sky, lighting the faces of the wounded as they loaded their last bullets. In the darkness, a medic whispered prayers over the dying. The nurse, Maria, still moved from man to man, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding with scraps of uniform. She had not slept in 2 days. Her lips were cracked, her eyes red, but she never stopped. The water had run out. The soldiers licked condensation off the walls. Some boiled leather belts to make a bitter soup. Still, they fought on. On the 3rd day, German engineers tried a new tactic. They pumped gas and smoke into the tunnels, hoping to suffocate the defenders. Men coughed, choked, and fainted, yet even as they fell, others dragged them to safety. One group of Soviet soldiers sealed themselves in a chamber and carved words into the stone with a bayonet. "We were 200. We will be remembered." The Germans eventually broke through one section of the fortress. They found bodies, weapons, and messages scratched into every wall. But deeper inside they heard voices, hoarse, defiant, still alive. By the 6th day, the Germans realized this was not a normal battle. This was a test of will, a contest between the living and the dead. General Fritz Schlieper wrote in his report, "The defenders of Brest fight like possessed men. Their courage is incomprehensible." For the Soviets, the fortress became a tomb, but also a symbol. Each wall, each corner, each pool of blood told the same story. They would rather die than surrender. And as night fell again over Brest, the stars flickered through the smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, a voice rose, cracked, weary, but still proud. "For the motherland!" We are still here.
By the seventh day, the fortress of Brest no longer looked like a fortress. It was a mountain of broken stone and twisted steel. The walls were blackened by fire, the courtyards littered with shell casings, spent grenades, and the bodies of the fallen. And yet, beneath the ruins, life still stirred. The surviving soldiers had moved underground, into the labyrinth of tunnels, cellars, and corridors that ran deep beneath the fortress. There, in the stale air, they found temporary refuge. The wounded lay on makeshift beds of sandbags and splintered doors. Candles flickered in broken bottles, casting trembling shadows on the damp walls. They were cut off from the world. No food, no medicine, no light. Only silence and the distant thud of German artillery above. Lieutenant Gavrilov walked through the tunnels, his steps slow, his face pale and gaunt. Every soldier who met his eyes saw the same thing: exhaustion mixed with something unbreakable. "Comrades," he said softly, "they think we are dead. Let's remind them we're not." That night, the defenders launched a surprise attack. They crawled through a collapsed section of the fortress and emerged like phantoms behind enemy lines. Their rifles were old, their ammunition nearly gone, but every shot counted. They struck quickly, vanishing again into the smoke before the Germans could react. To the invaders, it was madness. Fighting men who refused to die. Soldiers who rose from the ashes again and again. By now, the fortress was surrounded by barbed wire and tanks. German spotlights swept the ruins. Flamethrowers roared, sending streams of fire into the black holes of the walls. Screams echoed, then silence. Inside, Maria pressed her hands over her ears. She was the last nurse still alive. Her uniform was burned and blood-stained, her hair singed by fire. She whispered names she could no longer remember, trying to comfort the dying. In the far corner of the basement, Private Mikhail coughed blood into his hand. "Tell them," he whispered to Gavrilov. "Tell them we did not surrender." Gavrilov nodded, his throat tight, and turned away so the men wouldn't see his tears. The air grew thicker each day. The Germans dropped smoke grenades through cracks in the ceiling, flooding the tunnels. The soldiers tore their shirts to cover their faces, their lungs burning. And yet, every dawn, a shot rang out from somewhere inside the fortress. A single rifle, a single heartbeat of defiance. By the 10th day, the Germans were unnerved. Reports spoke of voices coming from the ruins at night. Whispers, footsteps, even singing. They thought the fortress haunted. In truth, it was the last defenders keeping watch. They took turns, guarding the wounded, listening to the distant sounds of battle far away. The war that had already moved east, while they still fought here. Forgotten. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain poured through the cracks in the ceiling, flooding the lower tunnels with cold, muddy water. The men cupped their hands to drink, blessing the rain like a miracle. For the first time in days, they could wash their faces, clear the blood from their wounds. In that darkness, someone began to hum a song, low, deep, and slow. Others joined in, their voices trembling. It was the song of the motherland, the anthem of those who refused to kneel. The rain mixed with tears. The sound of the hymn drifted through the shattered walls and out into the night, where the Germans listened in silence. For a moment, even they did not fire. In the bowels of the fortress, among the wounded and dying, The spirit of 200 men still burned brighter than the flames that tried to consume them. The fortress was no longer a place. It had become a heartbeat, steady, defiant, immortal.